The blazing afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of Fletcher's grocery, making the cramped store feel even more stifling. Sweat beaded on Marcus Carter's forehead as he stacked cans of soup on a rickety shelf, trying his best to ignore the rising tension in the room. It was just another day working under the tyrannical gaze of Richard Fletcher, the store's foul-tempered owner. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed a familiar figure shuffle through the door. Harold Jenkins, a frail, elderly man who relied on his cane for support. Harold was a regular customer, though his frequent visits were met with scorn by Fletcher, who seemed to loathe the very sight of him. As Harold made his way toward the counter, Fletcher's booming voice rang out. "Harold, back again? Didn't I tell you to stay out of my store?" Fletcher's sneer was as sharp as his words. "What are you doing here, you doddering old fool? You're just a waste of space." The room fell silent. Customers froze, some pretending not to notice, others watching the scene unfold with morbid curiosity. Harold, startled, gripped his cane tighter. His voice trembled as he tried to explain. I just need to pick up my medication, Mr. Fletcher. That's all." Fletcher's expression twisted into mockery. "Medication? You mean the stuff that keeps you alive just long enough to be a burden to everyone else?" He laughed cruelly, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Marcus felt his stomach churn. He hated Fletcher's outbursts, but this was beyond the usual insults and barking orders. This was humiliation, calculated and cruel. Harold didn't deserve this. No one did. Before Marcus could muster the courage to speak, Fletcher took it a step further. With a swift, deliberate motion, he kicked Harold's cane out from under him. The old man gasped, losing his balance and crashing to the floor. His bag spilled open, and pills rolled across the tiles in every direction. "Oops," Fletcher sneered, standing over Harold. "Guess you'll think twice about coming back here, won't you?" Harold struggled to push himself up, his hands trembling against the cold floor. The scene was unbearable. Marcus abandoned his task and rushed over, kneeling beside the elderly man. "Mr. Harold, let me help you," he said softly, gathering the scattered pills. His voice was kind, but underneath it lay a rising fury he couldn't contain. Before he could assist further, Fletcher stormed over and grabbed Marcus by the arm. His grip was rough, his face twisted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Fletcher hissed. "I told you to leave him alone. Do you want to lose your job?" Marcus froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. Losing this job wasn't an option. Not for him, not for his family. At just 22, Marcus bore the weight of responsibilities no one his age should have to carry. After the tragic loss of their parents 2 years ago, Marcus became the sole provider for his 5 younger siblings. He worked long hours at Fletcher's grocery, barely scraping together enough to pay the rent, keep the lights on, and put food on the table. But the greatest burden of all was Jonah, his youngest brother, just 7 years old, battling leukemia. The medical bills were staggering, an endless mountain Marcus climbed every day. He had already given up his dream of going to college, trading his future for Jonah's survival. If he lost this job, Jonah's treatment would be the first thing to go. Fletcher's grip tightened. "I don't care about your sob stories," he snapped. "If you help him, you're done here. Understand?" The words cut deep. Marcus swallowed hard, glancing back at Harold. The old man's eyes were full of gratitude, but also something else, quiet understanding. He knew Marcus couldn't fight this battle. Not today. Slowly, reluctantly, Marcus stood and stepped away. Harold managed to pull himself upright, using the counter for support. Fletcher barked at him to leave, and Harold shuffled toward the door, his head bowed. As the door slammed shut behind Harold, Fletcher turned back to Marcus. "Get back to work, and next time, don't even think about defying me." Marcus returned to the shelf, his hands shaking as he placed the last can in its spot. Shame and anger swirled inside him, but so did helplessness. He had made his choice, a choice that felt like betrayal. But what other option did he have? The walk home from Fletcher's grocery felt longer than usual. Marcus Carter's shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of guilt and exhaustion, his work uniform damp with sweat from the long shift. He had been replaying the incident with Harold in his mind all day. The humiliation in the old man's eyes, the cruel smirk on Fletcher's face, and most of all, his own inaction. By the time Marcus reached the small, rundown house he shared with his siblings, it was dark. The front porch light flickered, another reminder of the overdue utility bills he had yet to pay. He unlocked the door quietly, hoping not to wake anyone. But as he stepped inside, a small figure darted toward him. "Marcus!" Ellie, his 9-year-old sister, whispered loudly, throwing her arms around his waist. "Jonah's coughing again. I think it's bad this time." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He peeled off his shoes and hurried to the shared bedroom at the end of the hall, where Jonah lay curled up on a narrow bed, his thin frame trembling with each wheezing breath. The boy's pale face and hollow cheeks told a story Marcus wished he could erase. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Jonah's big brown eyes fluttered open, and he managed a weak smile. "Did you bring me anything from work?" Jonah rasped, his voice barely audible. Marcus forced a grin, pulling a small candy bar from his pocket. "Of course. What kind of brother would I be if I didn't?" Jonah's smile grew, though it quickly dissolved into another coughing fit. Ellie appeared at the doorway, worry etched into her young face. "Should we call the doctor?" Marcus shook his head. "We can't afford another visit right now," he murmured, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. "I'll give him his meds. He'll be okay." After settling Jonah back to sleep, Marcus retreated to the kitchen, where he sank into a rickety chair and buried his face in his hands. His mind raced with calculations, the bills, the groceries, Jonah's treatments, Ellie's school supplies. No matter how he added it up, it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The next day at work, Marcus's thoughts were still heavy when Fletcher called him into the cramped back office. The fluorescent light overhead flickered as Marcus stepped inside, bracing himself for whatever tirade Fletcher had planned. "Marcus," Fletcher began, leaning back in his chair with a snake-like grin. "You've been working here for a while now, haven't you?" "Yes, sir," Marcus replied cautiously. "And you've got, what, 5 siblings to take care of?" Fletcher's tone was casual, but his eyes glinted with something darker. Marcus nodded, his unease growing. "That's right." Fletcher reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a small brown bag, sliding it across the table. "I've got a little side job for you. It'll pay a month's salary in one go." Marcus stared at the bag, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" "Don't ask questions," Fletcher said sharply. "Just take it to the address on this card." He slid a slip of paper across the desk, his grin widening. "It's easy money, unless you want to keep scraping by and hoping your kid brother doesn't croak." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He opened the bag hesitantly, his heart sinking when he saw the small plastic packages inside. Drugs. "I can't do this," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "This is illegal." Fletcher's grin twisted into a sneer. "Suit yourself, but if you say no, you're fired. And if you tell anyone, I'll make sure the cops think you're the one dealing. Your fingerprints are already on that bag." Marcus's head spun. Fletcher's trap was airtight. If he refused, he'd lose his job. If he went to the police, he'd be the one in handcuffs. But if he agreed, he'd be crossing a line he wasn't sure he could come back from. Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw the hospital's number flashing on the screen. Dread pooled in his stomach as he answered. "Mr. Carter," the doctor's voice said urgently, "Jonah's condition is critical. If we don't receive payment by 6 p.m. today, we can't continue his treatment." Marcus felt the world collapse around him. He hung up without replying, his hands trembling. Across the desk, Fletcher's voice cut through his thoughts. "Well, what's it gonna be, Marcus?" He looked down at the bag, his mind a storm of fear, guilt, and desperation. His family's survival hung in the balance, and the weight of that decision was crushing. "I'll do it," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need a year's salary." Fletcher smirked, clearly amused by the audacity of the demand. "Deal. Now get out of here." As Marcus left the office with the bag in hand, his chest felt tight. He wasn't sure if he just saved his family or damned them. The address Fletcher had given Marcus led him to the heart of the city's Chinatown, a maze of narrow streets bustling with life during the day, but shadowed and foreboding at night. Marcus gripped the steering wheel of his beat-up sedan tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the unfamiliar streets. The small brown bag sat ominously on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the line he was about to cross. His mind raced with doubts and fears. What if this was a trap? What if something went wrong? But then Jonah's face flashed in his mind. His little brother, hooked up to machines, fighting for his life. Marcus shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. He didn't have the luxury of second-guessing himself. Finally, he reached the destination. A dimly lit alley behind an old marketplace. The stench of rotting produce and damp concrete filled the air. Marcus stepped out of the car, clutching the bag like it was a ticking time bomb. He glanced around nervously, his heart pounding. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, with a leather jacket and a cold, calculating gaze. "You Fletcher's guy?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Marcus nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He handed over the bag, his fingers reluctant to release it. The man opened the bag, inspecting its contents with a satisfied nod. Then he pulled out a black suitcase and shoved it into Marcus's hands. "Here's your payment," the man said. "Now get out of here." Marcus didn't linger. He rushed back to his car, throwing the suitcase onto the passenger seat. His hands trembled as he started the engine, the roar of the motor almost masking the sound of his pounding heart. Relief washed over him. It was done. He had the money. Jonah would get his treatment. Everything would be okay. But as he drove away, that relief was short-lived. Just a few blocks from the alley, Marcus spotted someone standing on the sidewalk, leaning on a cane. It was Harold Jenkins. Harold's eyes met Marcus's through the car window, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The old man's gaze wasn't angry or accusatory. It was something far worse, compassionate, understanding, as if he knew exactly what Marcus had done and why. Against his better judgment, Marcus pulled over and stepped out of the car. Harold approached slowly, his expression kind but serious. "Marcus," Harold began, his voice gentle but firm, "whatever you've gotten yourself into, it's not worth it." Marcus shook his head, his voice breaking. "You don't understand. My brother, Jonah's dying. He needs this money. I didn't have a choice." Harold reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "There's always a choice, son, but the one you're making right now, it's going to destroy you." Tears burned in Marcus's eyes as he stepped back. "I don't have time for this, Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I have to get this money to Fletcher." Before Harold could respond, Marcus climbed back into his car and sped off, refusing to let the old man's words sink in. When he returned to Fletcher's grocery, the store was dark, its neon sign flickering. Fletcher was waiting for him in the back office, his usual smirk plastered across his face. "Well, look who's back," Fletcher said mockingly. "Did you have fun out there?" Marcus set the suitcase on the desk and stepped back, crossing his arms. "I want my money. You promised me a year's salary." Fletcher laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "Did you really think I'd pay you that much? You'll get nothing, kid." Marcus's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about? We had a deal." Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his grin widening. "Go ahead, call the cops. See how far that gets you. That bag you delivered? It's got your fingerprints all over it. You're the delivery boy, Marcus, not me." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, fury and panic battling for control. "You bastard," he hissed. "You can't do this to me." Fletcher stood, towering over Marcus. "I already did. Now get out of my office before I make sure you and your sick little brother are out on the street." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking when he saw the hospital's number again. His hands shook as he answered. "Mr. Carter," the doctor's voice said softly, but with unmistakable sorrow. "I'm so sorry. Jonah passed away about 20 minutes ago. We did everything we could." The phone slipped from Marcus's hand, clattering to the floor. The room spun, Fletcher's mocking laughter fading into the background as Marcus stumbled out of the office. His vision blurred with tears, his legs carrying him to his car, without conscious thought. By the time Marcus pulled up to the hospital, it was too late. Jonah was gone. The day of Jonah's funeral was gray and somber, the overcast sky mirroring the weight in Marcus Carter's heart. He stood silently before the small grave, his siblings huddled around him. Their tears fell freely, but Marcus couldn't cry anymore. He felt hollow, his grief buried under layers of guilt and shame. He had failed Jonah. He had failed his family. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, a familiar figure lingered at the edge of the cemetery. Harold Jenkins. The old man approached slowly, leaning on his cane, his weathered face lined with empathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus," Harold said softly. His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of steel beneath the kindness. "I know this pain, and I know it feels like the world's falling apart." Marcus didn't reply. He stared at the headstone, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "You're carrying a heavy burden, son," Harold continued, "but you're not alone. You still have your siblings. They need you now more than ever." At that, Marcus turned to face Harold, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with despair. "What can I do, Mr. Jenkins? I tried everything. I gave up everything. And still, I couldn't save him." Harold placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his grip firm. "You can start by standing up to the man who put you in this position. Fletcher needs to be stopped, Marcus. Not just for what he's done to you, but for what he'll do to others." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "And how do you suggest I do that? He's got me wrapped around his finger. If I go to the cops, I'll be the one in handcuffs." Harold's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Marcus noticed something different about the old man, an air of authority that hadn't been there before. "What if I told you I could help?" Harold asked. "What if I told you I'm not just some feeble old man who shops at Fletcher's?" Marcus frowned. "What are you talking about?" Harold straightened as much as his cane would allow, his voice taking on a commanding tone. "I'm Detective Harold Jenkins, undercover with the Narcotics Division. I've been building a case against Fletcher and his operation for months. And you, Marcus, you can help me bring him down." The revelation hit Marcus like a thunderclap. "You're a cop?" he asked, incredulous. Harold nodded. "And I've been watching Fletcher for a long time, but I need someone on the inside to gather the evidence we need to take him down for good. You've already seen how he operates. You know how dangerous he is, but together we can end this." Marcus shook his head, his hands trembling. "I don't know if I can do this. I've already lost so much." Harold's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "You've lost, yes, but you still have your other siblings. You still have a chance to fight back. If you want to make things right, for Jonah, for yourself, then you need to take that chance." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could he really trust Harold? Could he risk everything again? But as he looked back at Jonah's grave, something shifted inside him. A spark of resolve flickered in the darkness. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could build a future. "What do you need me to do?" Marcus asked, his voice steadying. Harold smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "First, we're going to make Fletcher believe you're still on his side. He trusts you enough to involve you in his dirty work. We'll use that to our advantage." Over the next few days, Harold and Marcus worked together to plan their next move. Marcus returned to Fletcher's grocery, forcing himself to play the role of the desperate, obedient employee. He approached Fletcher cautiously, feigning desperation. "I need more money," Marcus told him one evening after the store had closed. "Jonah's gone, but I still have my family to take care of. I'll do whatever you need. Just give me a bigger cut." Fletcher eyed Marcus suspiciously, but greed eventually won out. "You're finally starting to think like a real businessman," Fletcher said with a sly grin. "I've got a shipment coming in tomorrow night at the docks. If you can handle yourself, there's more where that came from." Marcus nodded, his stomach twisting with nerves. He left the office and stepped outside, where Harold was waiting in an unmarked car. "It's set," Marcus said quietly, his hands shaking. "Tomorrow night at the docks." Harold gave a single nod. "Good. Now we make sure this ends once and for all." The night was cold and eerily silent at the shipping docks. Massive container crates loomed like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching across the dimly lit lot. Marcus Carter stood at the edge of the meeting point, his heart hammering in his chest as he clutched the burner phone Harold Jenkins had given him. He had already activated the tracking device Harold had planted in the car's trunk, ensuring that backup was ready to close in. But the fear was still there. If anything went wrong, Marcus knew he wouldn't make it out alive. Fletcher arrived minutes later, pulling up in a sleek black SUV. He stepped out, his confident swagger making Marcus's stomach churn. Behind him were two enforcers, their hulking frames unmistakably armed. Fletcher lit a cigarette and smirked at Marcus. "You're early. Good. Shows initiative," Fletcher said, blowing smoke into the frigid air. "The boss doesn't like waiting." Marcus nodded stiffly, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Fletcher led him deeper into the docks where another group of men was already waiting. At their center stood a man Marcus immediately recognized as the operations leader, a drug lord known only as Vince. Vince was shorter than Marcus had expected, but his presence was overwhelming, his eyes cold and calculating. "You the new errand boy?" Vince asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Marcus forced himself to nod. "Just here to help." Vince snorted, then gestured toward one of the containers. "Load it up," he barked at his men. The enforcers began transferring crates filled with illegal substances into waiting vehicles, while Marcus stood frozen, pretending to observe but keeping his eye on the tracker Harold had given him. As the operation continued, Marcus's phone buzzed softly in his pocket, a signal from Harold that the police were moving into position. Marcus's heart pounded as he prepared for the inevitable chaos. "Hey!" Vince called out, his piercing gaze locking onto Marcus. "Why so quiet? Got something to hide?" Before Marcus could respond, Fletcher stepped in with a sharp laugh. "Relax, Vince. He's one of mine. Kid's desperate. He'll do whatever we tell him." Vince's eyes narrowed, but he seemed to accept the explanation. "Desperate, huh? Good. Desperate people are the easiest to control." Marcus felt a fresh wave of disgust but kept his composure. "Just a little longer," he told himself. Suddenly, Vince's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "We've got company," he growled. "Cops. How the hell did they find us?" The air thickened with tension. Vince's eyes darted to Marcus, suspicion lighting up his face. "You!" he barked, pointing a gun at him. "Did you bring them here?" Fletcher's expression turned furious as he shoved Marcus. "You little rat! You think you can betray me?" Before Marcus could react, Fletcher struck him across the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. The tracker fell from his pocket, clattering against the pavement. Vince picked it up, his face twisting in rage. "You idiot!" Vince snarled, aiming his gun at Marcus. "You've just signed your death warrant." But before he could pull the trigger, the wailing of police sirens shattered the tension. Red and blue lights flooded the docks as officers swarmed the area, their weapons drawn. Chaos erupted as Vince's men scattered, some trying to flee, others opening fire. Harold Jenkins was among the first officers to arrive, his cane replaced with a badge and gun. He quickly assessed the situation, his voice commanding as he directed the officers. "Secure the perimeter. Don't let anyone out." Amid the chaos, Fletcher tried to escape, but Harold caught up to him, his aim steady. "It's over, Fletcher," Harold said coldly. "Hands up." Fletcher hesitated, his eyes darting to Marcus, who was pulling himself to his feet. For the first time, Marcus didn't flinch under Fletcher's glare. "You lose," Marcus said, his voice hard with resolve. Realizing he had no way out, Fletcher raised his hands, muttering curses under his breath as officers moved in to cuff him. Vince and his remaining men were quickly subdued, the entire operation collapsing in minutes. As the dust settled, Harold approached Marcus, his expression a mix of pride and relief. "You did well, Marcus. You kept your cool, and you helped bring this whole operation down." Marcus nodded, his body trembling as the adrenaline ebbed. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt," he said, his voice breaking. Harold placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You've been through hell, son, but you've got a chance to start over. If you want it, I'll make sure you get the support you need. We could use someone like you in the department." Marcus looked at Harold, his mind reeling. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined this moment, standing amidst the wreckage of his old life, finally free of Fletcher's grip. Slowly, determination replaced the fear in his eyes. "I want to make a difference," he said, "for my family, for Jonah." 1 year later, Marcus stood in a crisp new uniform, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, Harold stood beside him, his mentor and friend, as Marcus officially joined the police force. His 5 remaining siblings watched from the crowd, their faces filled with pride. Though the pain of losing Jonah would never fully fade, Marcus had found a purpose. He had fought his way out of despair and into a future he could be proud of, a future built on justice, resilience, and hope.